A pessimist sees the glass half empty. An optimist sees the glass half full. An engineer sees a glass that's twice as big as it needs to be. So what does an engineer make of L&D? Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
This episode of The Learning Hack is a jargon-free zone. My latest guest fights shy of the neurobabble and jargon that so often afflicts our industry.
In this podcast,
And which, hands up, occasionally might leak into the conversations on this podcast.
that's why I don't understand any of it.
There might be another reason for that, cynical bambino. My guest puts his plain-spokenness down to his background.
My background's in engineering. I'm a simple farm boy from New Zealand.
So what is he? Farm boy or an engineer?
It can be both, cynical bambino. From his origins as a New Zealand farm boy and with a degree in mechanical engineering, Paul Matthews is now CEO and founder of People Alchemy and a leading learning and development expert with 3 best-selling books to his name. It's his 2018 title, Learning Transfer at Work, that I wanted to talk to him about.
When I came into L&D, I looked at what was happening
He told me.
and I thought, well, hang on, there's a huge failure rate going on.
Failure.
And if I was an engineer and building products, I'd be killing people on a regular basis.
I wanted to know how learning transfer, that's making sure that what people learn translates into better performance and behaviours in their workplace, really works best. And whether he really believes that by doing it better, we can reduce this huge failure rate in L&D that he talks about.
So welcome to The Learning Hack, Paul Matthews. Can I first ask where you are and how this present crisis over COVID-19 is affecting you and your business?
Well, I'm in Milton Keynes today, not that sunny, but anyway, we're here and it's the middle of the country, hub of the universe, which is why it has so many roundabouts, I'm told. So,
Right.
But in terms of being affected, actually, we've been lucky as a company because day to day, not that much has changed. We were mostly working from home anyway. In terms of sort of sales and customers, we took some revenue drop, when there was an immediate reaction. And of course, one of the things that our software is used for is onboarding. So people were reducing their recruitment. But in other areas, it's also used for delivering online learning. So in that sense, we've had an uptick in sales and interest. So all in all, we've been very lucky and very grateful for that compared to some other companies.
So kind of what you lose on the swings, you gain on the roundabouts.
Yeah, it's very
fairly
much
common
the case for us.
That's fairly
And
common
on a
story.
rising curve now because of the increased interest in online delivery.
Absolutely. Okay. So I want to talk about learning transfer in this conversation, the subject of your book published in 2018, I think, and also about learning analytics, which we can get onto a bit later. But first of all, why do you feel that learning transfer is such an important area of focus for L&D?
I guess the simple answer is how can it not be the primary area of focus? One thing I sometimes ask people is what's the primary output of L&D activities? What's the end result that people are looking for? Why do we do anything in L&D for that matter? And this sort of comes back to 2 main reasons as far as I can see. One is the inevitable compliance stuff that's required where people need to learn certain things about certain topics in order to tick regulatory boxes. And then the other thing, of course, is to get people performing better. Otherwise known as behaviour change. So that's really the primary output, is getting people behaving in a certain way, following a course. So the focus really should be on those behaviours we're seeking to promote and encourage in the workplace rather than on what people might need to learn. So I think there's a huge focus on learning and not enough on why we're doing that learning.
Yeah. And there's a lot of should in there, I think. But I think there's also a kind of rather widespread feeling that maybe L&D doesn't get involved enough in the whole business of learning transfer. And, clearly what you said there, compliance and tick boxing. Well, if everybody has ticked the box to say they've done the learning and then they go and do something bad, like a bit of money laundering, well, it's not our fault because they got the training. And this is felt to be a bit of a prevalent mentality. Now, is that the case, do you think? Is it right to decry the lack of interest in learning transfer in L&D?
Well, absolutely. It's kind of like, I don't know, my background's in engineering, and when I came into L&D, I looked at what was happening and I thought, well, hang on, there's a huge failure rate going on here. If the output is a level of behaviour change that we're looking for and we're not getting that, in other words, we're failing in what we're doing. I mean, if I was an engineer and building products, I'd be killing people on a regular basis based on the fact that I couldn't abide by a failure rate that high as an engineer. So why should we need to be doing that in L&D? To me, it's failure, not getting learning transfer. So I think L&D has to be front and centre on that.
Yeah. And those examples remind me that actually, like all generalisations, that's slightly wrong, because there are certain areas of organisational training, I mean, if you include defence in that as well, where people die if the training doesn't go right. You could think of health and safety in oil and gas, for instance. People on North Sea oil rigs, if they are not properly trained about health and safety, then there is the potential for fatalities and so on. So in some areas of some parts of the forest, it is done, in others not.
I think also we've got to be very careful that we don't equate the training with the behaviour change.
Yeah.
We're back into that trap again of thinking because we've trained them, it's okay. They will behave in a healthy and safety way, for health and safety, just because we've trained them. That's not necessarily the case. Learning transfer still has to happen, even when it's compliance training. We still want them behaving in a way that's compliant with what is required. I did some work with a large pharmaceutical company many years ago on compliance training, and they came up with almost a double track process where they were doing a certain amount of learning in a certain way in order to satisfy the regulatory requirements to get the boxes ticked. And they were doing a second track of learning that was much more focused on the behaviour change they wanted out of it, because they realised that what they were having to do with compliance was not necessarily making people behave in a compliant way. Mm-hmm. And so when you use the example of an oil rig or defence or something like that, you've got to train in a way that ends up with the behaviours you need in order for them to behave compliantly.
So is that the heart of it, behaviour change? So let's get into talking about what learning transfer actually is.
Yeah, learning transfer is turning learning into action, I suppose, is a very, very simple definition. Is if we're going to deliver some learning to somebody, however we deliver that, how is it then operationalised afterwards into behaviour? Because if it isn't operationalised, then doing the learning in the first place was kind of pointless. So learning transfer is really at the heart of getting out the other end of what you're doing, what you really want, which is the behaviours. We really don't see if somebody goes on a management course, other than perhaps the facilitator, nobody much cares what they learned, but they do care how they behave as a manager afterwards.
And so what is the best way to make that happen? I mean, I suppose we're coming out of a world where it would have been a formal training course, say a day, maybe a couple of days, and then they're back into the workplace at some point. Is it a matter of filling in intervening steps? Is it a matter of making it an ongoing process? What's the best way to make that work?
I suppose if you think about it at a very simplistic level, right, I tend to do that. I'm a simple farm boy from New Zealand, so I kind of go back to the basics and say, if we want people to be doing things differently, we have to start them doing things differently. In other words, they've got to do things. So it really comes back to activities. It comes back to doing things. It comes back to practicing those things until those things become habitual or embedded and sustained in the way they behave in their general day-to-day work. So it will always come back, usually, to doing things. There's not a lot that we need to learn didactically to hold as memorized information that's available for recall. there's not much of that, particularly now with the web, with online support, all those kind of things. So facts and data that we might need to memorize, there's fewer and fewer of those in effect. But what we do need to get good at is being able to use practice skills to then utilize the stuff that we can pick up from a support resource or something like that. So it does come back to practicing skills. I mean, nobody gets better at a new skill immediately. It's not an event type thing. It's a process that takes time. And of course, the more complex the skill, the more time it will take, and the more iterations of practice will be required, and the better quality of practice will require. So it starts to become, rather than thinking, how can I deliver this learning to someone? And in these days, of course, how can I do that virtually? What we should be asking is, how can I deliver these behaviour changes to somebody? And that's a very different question to ask, and you end up with a very different solution. Because if you start thinking, how can I deliver behaviour change? Or particularly, how can I deliver behaviour change remotely, as we have now, you've got to start thinking, well, how can I get someone doing activities that will lead them into using that new behaviour on a regular basis in their workflow? And so it's about delivering typically activities to them over time, rather than here's a bunch of learning content, e-learning or otherwise, and then kind of crossing your fingers and hoping that they will, then start behaving differently as a result of doing some learning. We know very well that just learning something doesn't result in behaviour change. There's that learning-doing gap. I mean, we all know what to eat, but our diets, by and large, don't reflect what we know to do.
Yeah, and that comes to the kind of very tricky part of behaviour change that I think Julie Dirksen talks a lot about, the elephant and the rider. And the elephant is a much used metaphor, I think, and it's one that you brought up as well. As I think learning transfer is one of your elephants in L&D, is that right?
I talk about the elephants in the room, yes, and that's kind of where the phrase originally came from, is the elephant in the room, where people know about it, but people don't really talk about it that much.
Yeah.
And I talk to L&D people and I say, well, listen, what are you doing about learning transfer? Oh, we're doing a bit of this and a bit of that, but let's get back to thinking about how we're going to roll this out to our global audience or whatever. So it's something they kind of recognise is there, but then choose to ignore. I think one of the reasons for that is it's not so easy for them to hold many of the people that need to be involved accountable for what has to happen, because there's a lot of different people have to do a lot of different things in order for learning transfer to happen.
Yeah.
And there's no one kind of person that is able to hold everybody else accountable for contributing to all the bits that have to happen in order for learning transfer to go well. And the biggest piece in there, of course, is the culture of the organisation. So if somebody comes back from a training course, what is the expectation culturally within that organisation on what that person will do? In some organisations, they come back and there's just an automatic expectation. They'll help their colleagues learn the same thing. They'll start utilising, they'll start doing it. They'll talk to their manager. Their manager will have a cultural expectation to get involved with giving them time and delegate tasks that need the new skills and so on and so forth. So these are organisations with a very highly developed learning culture, and they're very rare. But most organisations, someone comes back from a training course, and in the very worst instance, the manager says, well, forget about that rubbish. I've never used it. In the more neutral thing, the manager says, oh, welcome back. Your in tray's full. Thank God you're back at your desk. Slightly better is the manager has a brief conversation and says, how did it go? Was it a good course? And so on. So there's a continuum of how their colleagues, peers and managers interact with people, and that has a massive impact on how much of that learning actually ends up being operationalized and useful to the organization. Because until it's operationalized, it's not useful.
Is there a problem? Is it a problem of ownership then in that case, that who actually owns learning transfer? Because it sounds from what you're saying, I think I've read elsewhere, perhaps in your book, that a lot of L&D people feel that they don't really own learning transfer. But it sounds from what you're saying as where companies have a good learning culture, line management is stepping up. What should that balance be? Should it be a balance, or should the ownership definitely be one or on one or other, in one or other of those silos?
Well, it's often why you need a level of senior executive sponsorship, who can cover off and sort of be, have some force that can be brought to bear on all of that. Because there are a whole lot of different, if you want to call them, levers that you have to pull. I'm a great fan of the work of Dr. Ina Weinbauer-Heidel from Austria and her transfer effectiveness, 12 levers. And you have to go and, I think, pull all of those 12 levers in order to get effective learning transfer. The problem is that the trainer in the room or on the virtual classroom can only pull some of those levers. Some of them have to be pulled by the manager. Some of them have to be pulled in by others, and so on. So there's no single point of accountability. And that's why I think learning transfer often doesn't happen, is because there's nobody kind of with that overview, that oversight, that single point of accountability. And it ends up being down to the individuals getting involved with doing bits that are not necessarily joined up in a way which gets you to where you need to be.
So what are the sort of things that would happen to make, if we can get kind of drill down into some of the activities, perhaps there's a question I should ask before that, which is, do you think that this is one thing or a variety of things? In other words, depending on the type of thing that you're training or learning in, learning transfer will be a different set of processes, from one place to another on an oil rig or in defence or whatever. Or are there sort of heuristics, rules of thumb that work across the piece?
I think it's a bit of both. It's always easier to look at the higher level stuff and then drill down into the detail depending on the individual circumstances or the course or the subject matter. But it's fairly obvious that if you're learning computer coding, you're going to have a different set of practices than if you're learning how to handle sharps in a hospital or food hygiene or whatever. So it is going to be subject responsive in that sense. But you can look at a higher level, what are the general things that need to be there? And there's three different areas that are involved. One is clearly the mindset of the learner and how because if the learner doesn't want to learn, then, full stop, there's an end point at there. You're not going to go any further. So the mindset of the learner, they've got to, want to do it. In other words, they have to be sold on the idea that it's worth doing for them. They also have to be sold on the idea that they could do it and they've got enough support around them for it to be possible to do. Because if they go into a program and thinking, well, I'll never be able to get to this level of competence, then they won't even start, particularly those with a more fixed mindset view of the world. And then they need to have enough sort of conviction that it's the right thing to do. They'll keep doing it even when they don't necessarily feel like it. It's like the volition to keep going, like going for a run on a cold morning when you don't want to do it, but it's the right thing to do. So that's the mindset of the learner. The next piece that you have to think about is the design of the program in general. And clearly part of that is having a pathway mapped out. So if somebody starts here and goes through these activities over a period of time, they will get to the end point of the pathway. So it's a bit like the blue line on your sat nav. When you set the end point in, there's a calculated route that will get you to where you want to go. Now, you might deviate along the way a little bit, but by and large, if you start at the beginning and follow the instructions, you'll get to where you need to go. So you need to have that route, that plan set out so that people know, I'm starting here and I know what's happening next. So that whole design thing needs to be. And of course, the activities you'll take along that route could be quite variable. It could be practice this, or sit in a corner and reflect on this, or look at this bit of e-learning, or get together with colleagues and discuss this. So all the different activities that you might have might be quite different. And this is where you then have to start getting specific based on the topic, the subject matter, and the kind of behaviours that you're trying to generate. Is it a behaviour based on a single skill, or is it a multiplicity of skills having to be pulled together into one primary behaviour? And then outside of that, you've then got how is the organisation supporting that whole process? which is things like, as I mentioned before about the culture, what are the expectations? How is the manager supporting? How are the peers supporting? And so on. So there's all those different factors that have to be brought into play. The issue is that there's usually no one person who's able to manage all of those factors.
Experience.
It's everything that ever happened to you, everything that ever will. Experiences, both huge and not so huge, slowly add up over a lifetime to become your experience. Everything you know, everything you are.
Experience.
And now the experience word is taking over learning.
Learning experience.
Our learning experience.
Learning experience design.
Learning experiences.
And some worry that the change will distract from what science has told us about how people learn. Do we even know what we mean by the words learning experience? Is this a learning experience? Or this? Or this? I've talked to some incredibly smart designers, theoreticians, L&D practitioners and technologists on behalf of the good people at Learning Pool. And together we've created a series of guides and resources to help you get the best from this change. Download the first of these now, the Experience White Paper.
Experience.
And perhaps even if the L&D person is aware of the importance of them and has kind of grasped how vital it is to be able to pull all these levers, it won't necessarily be in their power to affect all of those things. There will be things that are out of their control, perhaps.
That's usually correct. What I tend to recommend them is they've got to go and sell the people that can pull the other levers, can do the other things, on the fact that they have to do it. So someone still has to, I think, step up, and the obvious people to do that is L&D. So what they have to do is go to their client, their customer within the organisation, or if it's an external training company, go to the customer and say, listen, we can do this bit. This is our responsibility, but these other bits that you need to do in order to get learning transfer, you're going to have to go and do those. Now, we can help you, we can explain, but we can't do them for you. You're going to have to do them. And quite frankly, if you're not going to do them, you're not going to get an ROI in your training course. No matter how good a job we can do with our stuff, if the other stuff's not done, then the whole thing will fall apart at the seams, and the amount of learning transfer will be relatively low, and therefore you will not get an ROI that's, you would consider acceptable.
How important is measurement in all of this? As an engineer by background, you'll of course be pretty keen on measurement. Engineering,
yes,
it's a core part of engineering, and for many people, it ought to be, again, another ought, woulda, shoulda, coulda, ought to be a key part of L&D. But how do we best measure learning transfer, and what role does data play in making this work, do you think?
I think we're not actually measuring learning transfer per se. What we should be measuring is what are we seeking to achieve as a result of the training course or the result of the program. And that will come back to the set of behaviours that we're seeking to get out the other end. It always comes back to those behaviours. It's not about what we learned, it's about how we're behaving months after the course. So, for example, if I'm on a training course and I learn a new model about rapport or communication skills, one of those funny 4-quadrant models that we all know and love. Sometime later, I adopt my behaviour. I start doing things in a certain way because I think that works for me. 6 months later, you ask me, what was that model you learned? And I've completely forgotten what colours it was or what was on the different quadrants, but I'm still behaving in the way that the model helped me learn to behave in the early style. So then the question is, was that training course successful? I've completely forgotten what I learned on it, but I'm still behaving in a way that was desired. So you'd have to say, well, yes, the course was successful, even though I've forgotten what I learned. So right. It's not about measuring the learning. It's much more about measuring what did you want from the course, which obviously says then you have to be quite clear about what your outcomes are. So it's always about setting up a list of outcomes from your program that are behaviourally oriented. And then you can say, given I want these behaviours, now we've got a chance of saying, how are we observing these behaviours in the wild, in the workplace, months after the program, and therefore did we get the behaviour change that we were looking for? That's much more critical than saying, can someone pass this test and do these questionnaires on specific aspects of the learning?
Staying with the subject of measurement, is that subject in your experience to some of the other forces we talked about earlier? Is that L&D isn't necessarily in control of the data sources? So for instance, if you're training salespeople, they might not necessarily have access to the data of how those salespeople are performing after they get back. And this is something we hear again and again, that, again, L&D are often upbraided for not measuring enough, but very often they can't get the output data that would help them to see that learning transfer had actually taken place. How big a problem is that in your experience?
Well, if they can't get the data, I would say that's a major problem. And I would be surprised if they can't get the data. I mean, why would one department withhold data from another where it's advantageous to them to give that data and make it available?
Perhaps that's a bad example, but if L&D is looking for wider indications of health of the performance of the business, and there's a kind of, well, why do you need that? You can't have that. It's hard to get. It's expensive to get. Blah blah blah.
Well, there's some different levels of data we're talking about here. One is data that L&D can gather in its own right. From the participants, from the managers of the participants, from colleagues around the participants in the program. And that you can use, so observable behaviour ratings, like a multi-rater tool, 360-degree type things, those. You could do one of those at the beginning of a program, one at the end. We've got that built into our software automatically, for example, and that will give you a delta in the observable behaviours that have shifted across the length of the program. So that's the behaviour change thing. If you want to use the Kirkpatrick model, that's at level 3 thinking. Beyond that, then you need to be looking at typically business data. So this might be sales figures, it might be other bits and pieces. So what are the KPIs the business is seeking to achieve? And then can we build some kind of correlation between that and those behavioural changes? Beyond that, you might say, well, we don't have enough data already existing within the business, so we're going to have to develop some new metrics and some new ways of building measures to pull together into those. And that might be the difficult thing, is convincing the business to create some new measures, because they will see that potentially as extra work on their part. So that's where it might become difficult to get data if there's nothing that can be pulled relatively easy from existing systems. But there's very few businesses, particularly sizable ones, that don't have quite good data on and KPIs that people are working to.
Right. Okay. So focusing on those KPIs is really the way to do it. I noticed you referenced Kirkpatrick then. Without a denunciation, which seems almost knee-jerk nowadays, do you think that the Kirkpatrick levels still hold up? There are a plethora of models as well for evaluation, aren't there?
There's a number of them about. I wouldn't say it's a plethora. There's not that many of them. The origins of the Kirkpatrick model are sometimes disputed. Some people say it's Katzel that actually developed the model and Kirkpatrick publicised it.
Yeah.
It's been changed a couple of times over the years and is actually now recommended that people do it backwards. They start at level 4 and thinking, well, what are the results we want? How do we work backwards from there? And that to me is a much more sensible way to do it. I think it doesn't work so well when you're talking about longer term programs, but it can still be adapted. It's still a model that's worth, I think, thinking about, just because it's a simple way to explain things, and also But you've got to be careful of is that you're focusing on the levels 3 and 4, not levels 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And so it is a way to help explain to L&D people that there are different ways to look at evaluation. Another model that I think is very useful is the one that Brinkerhoff pulled together, success case method, which is much more based on qualitative and anecdotal data and studies the outliers on the bell curve. And that's a very powerful way of looking at a program when you're seeking to improve how that program operates.
Yeah.
Then you've got Will Thalheimer's L10 model and so on. So there's a few around. But yeah.
I've heard a criticism of some of those models, I think with the Brinkerhoff, that it gets a bit heavyweight and thus time-consuming and expensive to use. And
I would say like Phillips models are more like that when you're starting to try and drill into the data. So that was Phillips added that extra level onto the Kirkpatrick one. There are ways to use them at a more perhaps superficial level, I guess the aficionados would say, which give you quite a bit of the usefulness of the model without getting buried in the data and what you suggest, that extra stuff. Actually, the success case method of all of them is one of the lightest weight ones because you're selecting a few people on the ends of the bell curve and doing a couple of interviews. It's very qualitative and very simple to do. So it's not at all data intensive or data hungry at all.
So it's quite targeted to actually use. Yeah.
Well, what you're doing with that one is basically saying if we have people that go on a training course, there's going to be a bell curve of the results you get out the other end. There'll be some who did well, some who did poorly, and a bunch in the middle. The ones in the middle, if you examine them, will just give you middling answers, which aren't that useful. So go and explore the 2 or 3 at the top end of the bell curve and at the bottom, and then look at what was different about why did the ones that succeed so well, and why did the ones that fail so badly. And that will give you some interesting data. So the outliers will give you more interesting and useful data than the big wodge in the middle.
We began the discussion of learning transfer by talking about what happens after a formal training intervention, but that's kind of less and less the world of training and learning now. And in fact, during the pandemic, we haven't had any face-to-face formal training at all. It's all been online. So we're in a world now where a lot more stuff is provided digitally and can be provided, anytime, anywhere at need. So people talk about just-in-time training rather than just in case. And there is this current enthusiasm for the phrase learning in the flow of work or various variants of that. Do you think learning in the flow of work can help with learning transfer, or are there potential dangers there? In your book, you talk about a balcony moment that you often get if you're removed from the working situation to do training. It gives you a chance to reflect from perhaps a different perspective and a different view. Is there a danger in losing that, or do you think it's a good thing?
Well, learning in the flow of work actually is best for learning transfer. I mean, the learning transfer happens by and large as a result of the things that people do and what they learn from what they do after they start applying some learning. So it's that practice and experimentation. So it's the informal aspects of learning in that case that start engendering and enabling people to start using learning in an effective way in the workflow. The other thing about learning transfer is you can think about the distance of transfer. So if you do something in a classroom that has to be then translated by the learner into something they can use effectively in the workflow, there's a process they have to go through to enable them to bring it into the workflow. Whereas if they are picking up that bit of learning in the workflow anyway and then using it immediately, you've got a much more immediate transfer, a much more immediate shift. And also because they're learning it in the workflow, they're practicing it and learning about it very much in the context within which it's going to be used. So that is all great for learning transfer and helping people. Plus it will tend to come in smaller chunks if they're doing it in the workflow. They're not going to go away in a classroom in a day and then come back. In the workflow, they're going to use little bits and pieces as they need them. So as you said, it's more of a just in time sort of thing. But so what you can do is take the advantages from all of that and then stitch together a program that will help answer that question I talked about a bit earlier, which is how do we deliver behaviour change remotely? So in other words, what has to be in the package that we deliver to someone? What are all the components and pieces that have to be in that package that we deliver to someone over there so they can start learning stuff and practicing it and experimenting with it and then applying it in the workflow?
Yeah.
And some of that might be synchronous, by the way, so it won't necessarily be on demand whenever they want, but a lot of it can be asynchronous, and a lot more can be asynchronous than people, I think, used to believe. And that's what's happened now. The pandemic has shown that a lot of things we used to kind of take for granted. And certainly the senior teams, maybe not so much L&D, but senior teams will said, no, just put them in a classroom. That's what we've always done. We'll keep doing it. There was an expectation that learning would be delivered in a certain way. And that's what people asked for. Given that the pandemic has stopped, as you rightly point out, all that sort of classroom training, there's an expectation now that however learning and development delivers now will be different to what they were doing. They can't do it the same way, so therefore what they're going to deliver will be different. So the resistance to that change has evaporated. The resistance to online has evaporated. So this gives us an incredible window of opportunity now to make changes to the way we deliver learning and development solutions. And we won't get the kind of resistance that we would have got 4 or 5 months ago. So this is a wonderful opportunity to start looking at the behavioural science behind what people want, which is behaviour change, and start feeding things like that into the process and developing a set of activities spread over time that are being done largely in the workflow. In other words, on the line manager's watch, that will get to the point where the behaviours change. So how you structure those, I'm writing an ebook, I'm just actually finishing it off this week on the whole design, the strategic design process of thinking, how do we start redesigning our training so that we can deliver behaviour change remotely?
You're painting a very optimistic picture, which is what we need at a time like this. But I feel I have to offer a counter in a way. It's clear that the whole area of transfer and learning analytics has been an area of difficulty for L&D. Obviously, with the help of effective and knowledgeable advisors such as yourself, this situation can be ameliorated. And perhaps the pandemic has helped with that as well. But do you think there are some inbuilt limits to how successful we can really be with transfer, either in terms of practical blockers, the position of L&D within the organisation, in a way, well, within particular organisations, will be a bit of a blocker and is a given and hard to get round, or more complex stuff like the apparently rather elusive and maybe unquantifiable nature of learning in some contexts. Will we ever get to a position where every piece of learning is effectively transferred and measured, do you think?
I think if we ask that question, we're kind of asking the wrong one a little bit, just to push back.
That's my job, to ask the wrong questions, I think.
It's because I think that still focuses on learning as what we're trying to achieve, when I don't believe it's really the case. What we should be doing is saying, how can learning and development as a function, and perhaps we shouldn't even be calling it learning and development, perhaps we should be calling it the behaviour division or something like that, is how can we as that function generate the behaviours so that people can execute the corporate strategy going forward effectively. Mm-hmm. That's what it's all about. We're trying to do things so that people can effectively execute the corporate strategy, ultimately. So that's what we should be aiming for, which is the behaviours that will do that. And then we have to say, well, what are all the components, the pieces that we have to package together to get to those people, to enable them to exhibit and develop and then use the behaviours that are needed. And that will be, so all the things in that package have to be things like wrap them up in a culture where that is reasonable to do and expected. And part of that culture will be the management they're subjected to, and so on and so forth. It'll also be developing the program with a sequence of activities that will enable them to generate and build on those behaviours. So this is about delivering activities to people. So in a sense, you're talking about, we used the term workflow before, but a workflow is also a sequence of activities that people will put together. So like if a claim goes into an insurance company, it goes through desk after desk after desk through a workflow to get to the other end of the claims process. So it's that clear blue line I talked about. What is the workflow that we need to put someone through to get them to the other end of that, which is them exhibiting those behaviours we want to execute the strategy.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're saying that training and learning should lie much more alongside workflow, and that is the best way of achieving transfer.
Ultimately, yes, the closer we can bring the learning to where it's being used, the more effective typically it will be. There are some cases where that's not possible. There are some cases where taking a group away, putting them in a classroom and having a really intensive group session is a really wonderful thing to do and will get amazing results. But there are actually fewer and fewer cases where that's the optimum, in my opinion, and certainly far less than what we used to do. Of all the people I talk to, there's nobody that I would rate has said anything more than 50% of face-to-face training will ever come back. And some who I rate highly in the sector are saying a lot less than that.
So what are your top tips for people who want to do this, to get going and put learning transfer into action?
I think the primary tip is to start with the end in mind. Let's go back to Stephen Covey's wonderful 7 habits and ask, what do they need to stop or start or continue or accelerate doing in order to execute the corporate strategy that's been put in front of us? So that's starting to look at what do we want them to do? And then how do we need to support them to do those things? How do we need to develop them to do those things automatically, as part of just who they are and how they behave? What culture do we have to wrap around them? So if we start from that question, what do I need? What do they need to stop, start, and continue? And then how can I deliver that to them? That's where we should be starting from, not from where L&D typically starts from, is what do they need to learn and how can I deliver that learning to them?
Yeah.
That's only a very small part of the story, very small part. I typically say to people, if you have a one-day training course, actually without 2 or 3 days of learning transfer wrapped around that, the one-day training itself is pretty much worthless in most cases. It's not going to do very much. And the figures of transfer back that up, 10, 20, 30%. There's varieties of figures. So you need to do the extra stuff on top of a one-day training. So never talk about a one-day course, talk about a 3-day training, but one day of that happens to be in the classroom. And quite frankly, the classroom piece is not even the most important piece of that. You shouldn't put that synchronous instructor time on a pedestal. That's the wrong place for it. But of course, that's what L&D typically does, because that's what they know how to do. They design a course, they deliver it. It's all content focused.
One of the things I've been really struck by, and I'd say quite impressed by during our conversation, is the lack of jargon. I mean, we've covered a lot of subjects like learning experience design, I think, and learning theory, things like space practice, repetition, and so on, which would come out of cognitive psychology, is kind of embedded in there. Things that normally have a bit of fancy names or fancy terminology, but at no point have you resisted at no point have you given in to the temptation to start using some of that stuff, which kind of begs the question for me. How do you feel of the general debate within learning and development, which can get stuck into some very heavy questions of psychology and arguing about terminology and so on? Do you find all that stuff helpful, or?
I guess somebody's got to do it. It's not me. I can. I mean, I can participate in those conversations. I've read the papers. I've done the research. I've got 3 books out there. I can go there. And I've actually done webinars on things like behavioural science and nudge theory and all sorts. So I can go there if I need to. Yeah. I prefer not to typically, because I don't think it's that helpful often for the general practitioner who just wants to change things. as I said before, I'm a simple farm boy from New Zealand. If I hit it with a hammer, I know that's going to fix it. That's good enough for me. I don't even need to know why. I just need to know if I do this, I'm going to get this result. So I'm much more pragmatic, I think, perhaps than many. And I don't try and stand on that sort of scientific soapbox because I don't actually think it's that useful. Because you can argue over, does this bit of learning fit into the informal or the social aspect of learning? I kind of don't care. I'm more interested in what do we get out the other end and how does that help the organisation? So that's. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you noticed. It's not something I necessarily do totally consciously. It's just kind of where I like to come from. There's a much more pragmatic, simple view so that people can say, oh, I can work with that. I can get something from this that I can go away and use. Whereas if it's full of scientific jargon, that actually makes it a little less accessible. But I also quite like the fact that people are out there doing that because they are pushing the boundaries and we need that as well.
Lastly, what's the best way to contact you if people want to find out more about your ideas and what you do?
We've got a couple of websites. My personal site's at paul-matthews.com, and then the software we do is at peoplealchemy.com, or you can grab me on LinkedIn. So those are the easiest ways to get a hold of me. And I just love chatting about L&D, so I'm happy to have a chat with anybody, no strings attached, just to talk. And if I can help them a little bit, that's wonderful. So.
Well, thank you for chatting today to The Learning Hack, and thanks a lot.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the time.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Paul and to our sponsors Learning Pool, and to all our listeners and viewers. We're going to take a short break now for August, but we'll be back recharged and reanimated in September with a whole load of exciting new guests for us to milk dry of their wisdom on this, our knowledge farm. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. Please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube, and don't forget to leave a review and a 5-star rating. You can reach me at John Helmer on Twitter or through my website, johnhelmerconsulting.com. Be sure and enjoy your own summer holiday if you're taking one, and we'll see you all back here at the Hack Shack in September. Bye for now.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to pause you for a second because my daughter is locked out and is messaging me to let her in.
Okay.
Hold on just a second. Just got me.